So welcome, all of you. It's been a few weeks since we've seen each other. So our topic for tonight is the modernist attack on the divinity of Christ. Was Christ's claim a myth? Now, last time, which was 3 weeks ago, the lecture was on Christ's claim to be God. And so we looked at all the different ways in which Christ made a divine claim. In just about every page of the gospel, in one way or another, he makes clear that he claims an identity that no other human being has ever claimed, to be the Son of God, to be God. And we've also seen that precisely because it's a claim that no one else has ever made, it's a shocking claim. No, it's a claim that's meant to make us pose a question. Is it true? It's not just something we say, wow, what an interesting thing. It's a claim that affects every human being. No, and Jesus makes that clear in the Gospels when he asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? No, first he asks, who do men say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am? And it's a question that's put to every human being. No, Christ's claim to be God, the Son of God, poses that question to everyone. No, is it true? Who is he? Who do we say that he is? And the people understood the novelty of it because the people in Galilee and Jerusalem, they would always say, no one has spoken like this man. Right? In other words, this was unique. This wasn't another rabbi. This wasn't another great theologian. This wasn't another corner preacher. And so Christ's claim poses a question. And we can formulate the question like this. Either he was who he said he was, or he was crazy, or he was lying. And it wouldn't be an ordinary lie, no, because to lie that you're God is a very special kind of thing. It's called blasphemy. And this would be the supreme blasphemy. And so he wouldn't be a mere liar, but he would be the worst man who ever lived. Right? He would be like the devil incarnate. And this argument is beautifully formulated by C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity. It's a masterpiece, his whole book, and especially this page in which he sets this out. It's absolutely fantastic. He says it like this. I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. They say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. I'm just going to interrupt you. That's actually how I was brought up, more or less in my house. My dad had, I think, that idea that he was a great moral teacher. But that's where the matter ended. Anyway, so C.S. Lewis goes on. He says, I'm trying to prevent anyone from saying that. And he calls that a really foolish thing to think that. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic, on a level with someone who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great moral teacher. He has not left that door open to us. He did not intend to. Right? It's a fantastic paragraph. Right? There are three possibilities. He is what he said he is, he's crazy, or he's the greatest blasphemer in history. And that was the question that, it's the question every man faces. It's the question that Christ asked his disciples, and it's the question that was asked at his trial. And we'll look more at that next week when we look at the trial of Christ. But that's what it was all about. The trial was about that. Which of the three? And how did the trial come out? That he was a blasphemer. The greatest blasphemer who ever lived. But at least they took his claim seriously. They didn't, Caiaphas didn't say, well, he's a great moral teacher, and let it go at that. Right? That would be worse, in some sense. That would be to not even hear the claim. Now, we'll look next week at the trial, and we'll see that the trial wasn't reasonable. And there's a reason why it wasn't reasonable. Because of an attachment, a self-interest on the part of the key players in the trial. And that judges people's... it makes it impossible for them to judge correctly. Now, a beautiful statement of this dilemma, I've mentioned this several times in earlier talks, is that of Eugenio Israel Zoli, who became the chief rabbi during World War II in Rome, chief rabbi of Rome, and he converted to Catholicism in 1945. And he took the baptismal name of Eugenio in honor of Pope Pius XII, whose first name was Eugenio. And he has a beautiful book about his life, an autobiography, Before the Dawn. And he describes his first contact with Christ. And it's a beautiful statement of what C.S. Lewis calls the trilemma. Now, which of those three is he? So he tells us what happened was he was studying in school in Poland, and one of his schoolmates was a Catholic, Stanislaus, and Stanislaus invited him to study in his living room, and they had a crucifix up on the wall. And so he writes, sometimes, I don't know why, I would raise my eyes to that crucifix and gaze for a long time at the figure hanging there. This contemplation, if I may call it that without exaggeration, was not done without a stirring of my spirit. Why was this man crucified? I asked myself. Why did so many people follow him if he was so wicked? And why are my mother's friends who follow this crucified one so good? He's talking about his mother, obviously, was Jewish, but she had many friends who were Christian, and they would go together on missions of charity. And he came to admire these women who were Christian. And so he asked, why were they so good if they were followers of somebody who was the greatest blasphemer of history? And then he goes on. He does not cry out in his pain. He does not lament. He does not curse. On his face is no expression of hatred or resentment. No, he, Jesus, that man, now he was he for me, with a capital H. He was not bad. He could not have been in any way wicked. Perhaps he was. Perhaps he wasn't the servant of God whose canticles we read at school. Perhaps he was, or perhaps he was not. That sufferer of whom the Master told us briefly, I did not know. But of one thing I was certain. He was good. In other words, Zoli could see that it couldn't have been the third alternative, that he was the devil of hell. That couldn't be. He could, and I think anyone who reads the Gospels can see that he can't be the devil of hell. And he can't be a lunatic. Which would seem to leave only one option. He is who he says he is. But unfortunately, in the last 2 centuries, there's been added a fourth alternative by many Catholic exegetes, first Protestants. Now, it started in the 19th century with liberal Protestant exegetes. And the claim was made that by these Christians that Christ's claim was a myth. In other words, he didn't actually make the claim. It was put into his mouth later by his well-meaning followers. And so he didn't make the claim. So this would be a fourth alternative. He is who he says he is. He was a lunatic, a blasphemer, or a myth. So let's look at this fourth possibility to see how it holds up. In other words, his claim, they don't say that Christ was a myth. Exegetes think that he really lived and that he was crucified. He was a Jew from Palestine, from Galilee, and he was crucified. Everyone agrees at least on that. But they don't agree on anything else. They agree, he made some kind of claims perhaps, but what they do is they systematically distrust the gospel claims by saying that they were the product of, a myth or a legend that grew up after his death. Now, this started in the early 19th century and really reached its peak about the beginning of the 20th century. And it was condemned within the Catholic Church by St. Pius X, a great saint pope at the beginning of the 20th century. And he condemned it under the name of modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. But it didn't die. It went underground for a while, but it resurfaced, and it's very common to hold at least more or less these kinds of views. An extreme example is given by the best-selling Da Vinci Code. Right? That would be an example of basically what Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, claims is that Christ never claimed to be God, and in fact, he thinks none of his disciples claimed it either. It was a claim first made by Constantine. Okay, now that's totally and utterly ridiculous, and we don't need to refute it. But what the exegetes say is that it was a claim made by his followers, but not by him. So let's look at that. But first let's ask, why do they hold this? And there's an obvious answer. It's to avoid the trilemma is the name that I give to C.S. Lewis's argument, because a dilemma is when you have two alternatives, both of them difficult, a dilemma. So a trilemma would be when you have three alternatives, all of them difficult. And so with the modernists, it's really a quadrilemma, sorry for coining the word, a quadrilemma, in other words, four difficult alternatives, the fourth being Christ's claim was a myth. All right, so why do they hold this? And the answer is clear. To avoid the trilemma. In other words, to avoid having to say one of those three. He is who he said he is. He's a lunatic or a blasphemer. Right? So that's why they come up with this. And it's interesting because it's the first time in history. Previous opponents of Christ's claim said he was a blasphemer. Nobody ever said really that he was a lunatic. But we can see during his public ministry, that's what those who didn't believe his claim said. Know that he was working his miracles through the power of Beelzebub. In other words, through the power of the devil. And Caiaphas condemned him precisely for being the greatest blasphemer. So this is new. It's an attempt to evade one of those three. To say, he was good. He's not a blasphemer. He's good, but he's not God. In other words, a great moral teacher. So what is it? It's an attempt to remain a Christian and deny the divinity of Christ. And this was liberal Protestantism in the 19th century. And it's an attitude that maybe we wouldn't go all the way, but it's an attitude that's infected many sectors of Catholic theology, more or less. And so it's really important to talk about this and to be clear why this is crazy. Now, it started out in the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, the 18th century, philosophers rejected the notion of the supernatural, the idea of miracles, the idea of any divine intervention in history. It was known as deism, the idea that God exists. He's like a clockmaker God. He puts the world in motion, and then he doesn't intervene in it. He keeps his distance. And why did people think that? Because that's the way they wanted it. It's like putting up a no trespassing sign. We acknowledge your existence. We acknowledge that you created us, but please stay out so that we can be sovereign here. And unfortunately, this was the dominant attitude of the 18th century and of some of our founding fathers of this country. It was the dominant attitude of the French Revolution, the dominant attitude of Freemasonry. And at the beginning of the 19th century, it began to infiltrate many liberal Protestant theologians. They wanted to have a religion that was still Christianity, but a religion within the bounds of pure reason. That's a phrase from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Philosophy in the bounds of pure reason. And so how do you do that? Well, you have to strip away from the gospel everything supernatural. So all the miracles, all the prophecies, and Christ's divine claim. You'd have to strip all that away. But how do you do that? What about the virgin birth? What about the resurrection? Well, what they said was these are myths. They're very respectable myths, they said. They're not myths in the sense of something totally false. They're myths in the sense that they contain some religious truth, but without historical truth. In other words, they made a separation between history and faith. And they said that what the Gospels give us is not the Jesus of history, but the Christ of faith. And that's important, they said. That's a religious truth. It's just not a historical truth. And so if we wanted to get to the historical truth, what we'd have to do is simply take away everything supernatural. Demythologize is the way they refer to it. And what that meant was taking away the miracles, taking away the prophecies of the Old Testament, and taking away Christ's claim to be God. But what's the problem with that? The problem is you'd have to take away just about everything. And, well, people didn't realize that at first. They thought that they could do it. In other words, they thought that they pictured the 19th century liberal Protestant exegetes, they pictured themselves like archaeologists. And so what they were trying to do is to go below the Gospels. They thought that the Gospels were these mythological developments, a later development, and so just like in archaeology, you go below the surface to get to a deeper layer. They thought you could do the same with the Gospels and with the Bible in general. And so you have to dig. And what that would mean is that the surface layer wouldn't be the important layer. The important layer would be what's underneath. But what's the problem? It's obvious. When you're doing archaeology, when you dig below, what you really do find things, right? You find pottery, you find buildings, you find walls that have collapsed, you find levels and levels and levels that you actually can touch and take out and document and put on a display. But when you try and do archaeology on the Gospels, what happens? You dig below the surface, and what do you find? Your own idea. You find your own hypothesis. Because there's nothing under the Gospels. There's no... we don't have any texts that were, say the Gospel of Matthew in an earlier stage. Right? We don't have any Gospels that were prior to the Gospels that we have. The only Gospels that we have are these Gospels. So any attempt to do archaeology is not at all like an archaeologist, right? It would be, to make a better analogy, it would be like an archaeologist trying to dig and finding just dirt. And then in that dirt, making all kinds of castles or something. That wouldn't get very far in archaeology because you didn't really find anything. And so this attempt to go below the Gospels is inherently totally subjective because each exegete finds whatever they want to find. And thus everyone's finding will be different. And that's what happened. People in the 19th century, these exegetes, they wrote different lives of Jesus. So it became a literary genre to write a life of Jesus. And the life of Jesus wouldn't be based just on the Gospels. It would be based on the writer's idea of who Jesus was. Now, this went on during the 19th century, and it was called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. And countless books were written as part of this quest in the 19th century. And it came to the point, though, in which everybody realized, well, I reconstruct like this, you reconstruct like that, somebody else reconstructs like this, and we don't agree. And we don't have any criterion for saying who's right, because the only text is the Gospels. There's no text beneath the Gospels. By the way, this still continues today. You've probably heard people talk about Q. That's a document that nobody's ever seen, and nobody ever will see. It's a mythical, now there we have myth. It's a mythical document that's supposed to be under the Gospels. And you can go to the bookstore and you can buy Q. Q stands for the German word source, Quelle. And so you can go to some theological bookstore and buy some scholar's reconstruction of what Q was. But somebody else can write a totally different, you could get thousands of different Qs. Anyway, it got to the point at the end of the 19th century where an exegete, a very interesting, a great man, Albert Schweitzer, and you probably have heard his name for another reason, because he was a great philanthropist. He went to Africa and started a hospital for the poor. And he was also a great organist. And so musicians know Albert Schweitzer because he was one of the great interpreters of Bach on the organ. But in any case, he was also a theologian, and that was his principal occupation. And he wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, a critical study of its progress. And the conclusion that he comes to is that the quest totally failed for the reason that we just said. Because once you put down the premise that the Gospels don't give us historical truth, what are you going to find? The only thing you can find is total skepticism. It'll come to the point where we don't have the faintest idea what Jesus said or did, except for one thing, that he was crucified. And that's about it. And you can see this in a recent publication called The Five Gospels. I don't get this, but it's sold a lot of copies, written by a group called the Jesus Seminary. It's a group of scholars, Protestant and Catholic, unfortunately, mostly Protestant, but some Catholics. And it's called The Five Gospels. Now that's surprising. There are only 4 Gospels. Well, they put a Gnostic Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, as one of the Gospels, so it's the 5 Gospels. And it's color-coded, such that if they think that Jesus actually said something, it goes in one color. If they think that, well, this is the product of, the first 40 years afterwards, it goes in another color. If it was something that happened, 80 years after, it goes in another color, etc. So it's color-coded according to what they think, how mythological it is, the statement. Well, the things that they actually attribute to Jesus are very, very few. It comes down to, I think, our Father and a few other things. But something like, I'd have to check. Something like 5 different cases where Jesus actually said it. And so the conclusion is we don't know anything about what he actually said or did. Now that's how it came to be at the beginning of the 20th century. So for Schweitzer, it was a failure. And Ratzinger, before he became Pope, in one of his books, he describes this as saying, this quest for the historical Jesus, what was it really? How strange that each exegete, what did he find? He made a portrait not of Jesus, but of himself. In other words, of his own preconceptions. So liberal Protestants, what did they find? Obviously, they found a liberal Protestant Jesus. And in our own day, liberation theology does a similar kind of thing. So what did they find? Liberation theology is a kind of Marxist theology. Well, they found a Marxist Jesus. And one of the most famous theologians of the early 20th century, his name was Rudolf Bultmann, had incredible influence. He was an existentialist philosopher, a pupil and an acquaintance of Martin Heidegger, a German existentialist philosopher, also an atheist. And so what does Bultmann find? Well, Jesus was a kind of Heideggerian existentialist philosopher. And for them, this was beautiful, in fact, the fact that we didn't know anything about Jesus, because it meant that you could find what you wanted to find. But is that what we want? We want to find God. No? And we want to find precisely, and what we do find in the Gospels, what makes the Gospels the most compelling book on the face of the earth, is because we find something that no one would ever have dreamed of. Right? That's the Gospels are incredible because no one could have invented them. To start with Christ's divine claim and all the 1,000 ways that he made it, and things like the Eucharist and the passion of God made man. Nobody would ever invent any of it. That God becomes man, that he gets put to death, and that he wants to make himself present under the appearances of bread and wine. Anyway, nobody would ever have invented any of the gospel. And all of these reconstructions of the historical Jews, where they come up with something commonplace. They come up with Jesus being a kind of a great moral teacher or a kind of professor. And Ratzinger, in his book, Jesus of Nazareth, he makes fun of this. He says, professors don't get crucified. The fact that he got crucified makes it absolutely obvious that he made a claim that doesn't look like that of Martin Heidegger or even of Karl Marx. So how should we respond to this? Okay. It would be one thing if these claims were made by unbelievers. That would be understandable, right? The difficulty is that they're made by Christians, and they're made by people who in some sense intimidate us because they're theologians, and they've got degrees, they've got doctorates, and maybe multiple doctorates, and they've got reputations. And so it's hard for the simple faithful to not to be influenced by it. Well, the key thing to keep in mind is common sense. So that's what we're going to try and do here. We're going to make a common sense refutation of this, let's say, this modernist attack. So what they're really saying is that somehow, inexplicably, a gulf came about between the historical Jesus and the Gospels and the Christian tradition. A gulf that is, in some sense, immeasurable, because what they think is that the historical Jesus didn't say that he was God, didn't make a divine claim, was a great moral teacher, a great rabbi, and that was that. A liberal Protestant kind of rabbi, if you like, or a Marxist kind of rabbi, or a Heideggerian rabbi, but a rabbi. And somehow it came out that he claimed to be God. And how did that happen? How would that have happened? And how long did it take for that to happen? Not much time. Right? That's all you have to see. Nobody doubts that St. Paul's first letters were written some 20 years after the crucifixion. Well, can myths happen in that space of time? How long has it been since the Holocaust? 60 years? Is that right? 65 years? All right, there are some people who say that was a myth, no? But what does the world do? We laugh at them. And not just laugh at them, we hold them to be abominable and execrable. People like Ahmadinejad. But we laugh at them because there's so many people still alive who were there. Right? My mother-in-law was there. And so the key thing basically a claim is being made that in a short space of time, what Jesus really did and said got totally lost, and something completely other got put in its place, and people didn't protest. And on the contrary, they saw it as pious that happened. And you'd have to put the apostles in the first place, and then all their disciples. Now, the exegetes who think that this happened, they're not blaming the early Christians for doing this. They think that the early Christians did a good thing because they came up with religious truths, even though they're not historical truths. Now, I think that's the first thing that we have to say here is, if something is historically, Christianity is based on a historical claim, right? That Jesus really said and did certain things in history, right? In the Creed, we've got some historical things. We put historical names. He suffered and died under Pontius Pilate. We locate it in history. And we think that Jesus' incarnation, his suffering and his death and his resurrection are the most important historical events of the history of the earth. But they're historical events. And the fact that they're historical events isn't accidental to it. I'm sorry, it's essential because we're redeemed because in history, God became man, suffered, died, was buried, and rose from the dead. And if that didn't happen in history, we're not redeemed. In other words, we can't separate a Jesus of history from a Christ of faith. Right? That would be crazy. Now it's not the first time. Back in the 13th century, something much less dramatic, but similar, occurred. It was at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas. A contemporary of his at the University of Paris was teaching that there were two truths. There was a truth of philosophy and another truth of theology. That something could be true in philosophy, or let's say false in philosophy, but true in theology. And the reason why he said this is because he was a follower of an Arab philosopher named Averroes, and this Arab philosopher thought that he proved through Aristotle that the soul is not immortal. But yet we believe through faith that it is immortal. And so this Christian was teaching that at the University of Paris that through philosophy we can show that the soul is not immortal, but we believe in theology that it is immortal. Now, obviously, we can't, right? That's psychologically impossible. Nobody can say, philosophically, I'm absolutely convinced that this is false, but in faith, I believe that it's absolutely true. What can happen is something that we believe it can be above reason. I don't see how I can't prove either that it's true or false. But it can't be that I can show that something's false and believe it to be true. Right? We can't do that. And so St. Thomas got very offended by this. St. Thomas Aquinas was normally the most meek and mild-mannered person in the entire world. And he never got upset at anybody, even when people interrupted him and called him the worst names. But he got angry this time. He got angry at this guy because he was saying there's a double truth. And so this is the one time St. Thomas lost his cool. And he wrote, he thinks that faith is of things whose contrary can be necessarily concluded. It follows from this statement that faith is of the false and impossible, which not even God can bring about, and the ears of the faithful cannot bear. Well, something similar is being claimed by these modern exegetes. They're claiming that something is false in history, but true in faith. Well, that's ridiculous. That we can't even think that. How can it be true in faith if it's false in history? We can't believe in the message of the Gospels unless we believe the history of the Gospels. Does that make sense to everybody? So what it means to have Christian faith is to believe the history of the Gospels, not just the religious theory of the Gospels. Because the religious theory of the Gospels is all about history. God became man in human history. Under Herod, he was born, he suffered and died under Pontius Pilate, and he rose from the dead on the third day. And that's all in historical claims. Okay. All right, so is it credible to do this? So let's look at that. So to maintain that Christ's claim wasn't really made, we'd have to say that the entire gospel basically was the product of the imagination of the anonymous early Christian community. So let's have to ask ourselves, is that reasonable to think that? Well, first of all, what do anonymous communities ever make important works of art? Let's think of, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Could that have been made by an anonymous community of thousands of people? Right? That's ridiculous. Think of the Shakespeare, Dante. Great works have to be the products of individuals who are specially gifted. Now, of all the works that exist on the face of the earth, what could be more unforgettable, more vivid, more have the taste of life than the Gospels? No, they're the most unforgettable page. And a non-believer can see that too. Because I remember before we came to faith, some 25 years ago, the Gospels were unforgettable. I mean, you read the Sermon on the Mount and you can't help but admit that this is vivid in a way that the greatest fiction isn't. The Beatitudes, the Passion narrative. And so basically, to think that the Gospels are a mythological product, a product of later the anonymous community, is to think that anonymous community was somehow the author of the most unforgettable images of all of human culture. Benedict makes fun of this in the foreword of his book, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, how could these unknown groups, these anonymous groups, be so creative? How were they so persuasive? How did they manage to prevail? I'm at the bottom of page 5, for those of you who are following. Sorry. Last part. How are they so persuasive? How did they manage to prevail? Isn't it more logical? Even historically speaking, Benedict is so modest in his way of writing. No, he's not like me. He's very soft-spoken. Isn't it more logical, even historically speaking, to assume that the greatness came at the beginning and the figure of Jesus really did explode all existing categories and could be understood in the light of the mystery of God? Isn't that more logical? Right? Instead of putting the miracle, the figure of Jesus, in this anonymous group, wouldn't it be more reasonable to put it in Jesus himself? Now let's look at simply what do we know about the Gospels. Well, the Gospel of Mark, according to the earliest witnesses from the early 2nd century, a man named, we looked at this last fall, a man named Papias, who was a disciple of John the Apostle. He said that the Gospel of Mark was written by the spiritual son of St. Peter, who was St. Mark. He founded the church in Alexandria later. But he was St. Peter's secretary. And wrote down what St. Peter preached. And it seems, it's not certain, but it seems that a fragment of the Gospel of Mark was found in the caves of Qumran, which were sealed up in the year 68 AD. They were sealed up when the Roman armies besieged the Holy Land. So that would mean that the Gospel of Mark had to have existed before that and had to somehow find its way to Israel to get into the caves of Qumran. What about the letters of St. Paul? Well, the earliest letters of St. Paul are 20 years after the crucifixion. And St. Paul constantly speaks of Jesus as Lord. And Lord was the way that you said the holy name. It would have been in Hebrew, Adonai, which in Greek are translated Kyrios, and in Latin, Dominus. But Adonai in Hebrew was what they said instead of saying the holy name, Yahweh, which could not be said. No, that was blasphemy. Only the high priest could say, once a year prostrate before the Holy of the Holies on the Day of Atonement. And so when Paul says that Christ received the name above every other name, Lord, right, we should think the name that God revealed to Moses in the burning bush. So Paul, at every opportunity, calls Jesus Lord. And he also speaks of him as God, not as frequently, because that's a name normally reserved for the Father. He distinguishes the persons by calling the Father with what would correspond to the Hebrew Elohim, and he calls the Son by what would correspond to Yahweh. But in any case, he also calls Jesus God in Romans chapter 9, verse 5. And many other places. You know? So he, and this is 20 years after the Gospels. And so, is it reasonable to think that Jesus didn't make that divine claim, and yet Paul has already made it 20 years later, and nobody protests? People protested against Paul for other things, right? Paul was very much the object of controversy, but not because he called Jesus Lord, but because he said the Gentiles didn't need to be circumcised. Right? And so it's not that Christian history doesn't give us controversy. Christian history of the first century gives us plenty of controversy. But it doesn't give us any controversy at all about the divinity of Christ. That's something that is peacefully put forth by everyone. Now, with regard to the idea that the stories such as the miracles and the resurrection were later additions, let's listen. St. Paul speaks about that, and we looked at this in an earlier talk in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15. And that's dated the year 55, 56. And he says that the resurrection was witnessed by 500 people. And he goes on to say that most of them are still alive, and you can ask them. In other words, you could go to them, and they could give their witness. Although some of them, he says, have fallen asleep. In other words, some have died. But the great majority of those who saw Jesus' resurrection are still alive when Paul's writing his letters to the Corinthians. And so what that means is, it's like today. There are people alive who were in the Holocaust. And so you can't just go making something up because their witness is still alive. Well, at this time, in the time of St. Paul's letters and the time in which the Gospels were written, there were plenty of witnesses, 500 of the resurrection, let alone of the other preaching of Jesus. St. Peter, in his second letter, he refers to this rationalist, modernist interpretation already. He says, we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we had been eyewitnesses of his majesty. And then he goes on to tell about the transfiguration, because he was one of the 3 disciples who was present at the transfiguration, Peter. So he says, for he received honor and glory from God the Father when that unique declaration came to him from the majestic glory. This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. We ourselves heard this voice come from heaven while we were with him on the holy mountain. Right? In other words, we didn't follow cleverly designed myths. You say, this is history. I was there. I heard this and saw this. Now, sometimes people think that, okay, maybe the Synoptic Gospels are closer in history to Jesus, but John is, that's theology. In other words, it's very common among exegetes, even Catholic exegetes, to think that the discourses in the Gospel of John are not really historical things that Jesus said. And they give a fancy Greek name for this to make it sound more acceptable. They call it a theologumenon. Sorry. And a theologumenon means it's true theologically, but it's not true historically. He didn't really say it, but the early Christian community put it on in his mouth to express this theological truth. And this doesn't make any sense. Right? It doesn't make any sense because these are people who they're convinced, right? St. John totally believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Right? You see that from the beginning of his gospel. You see it all through. You see it from his letters. Now, if he believes Jesus is God, is he going to make something up himself and put it in Jesus' mouth as if Jesus had said it, giving John's own words the authority of God? Wouldn't that be blasphemy of the worst kind? Yeah. So we shouldn't think that that's the case. No, we shouldn't think that John would make something up. And the fact is that John is still writing in the period of living memory, even though his gospel was probably the last. And that's because John lived the longest. John lived to about the year 100. But the fact that he had this long life doesn't mean that it's not within the period of living memory. And he himself, of course, was the most important eyewitness, one of the 3 favorite disciples. The one who put his head on Jesus' breast. Jesus' beloved disciple. In fact, of all the witnesses, okay, Peter had more authority because he was the head of the college. But John was certainly more important in another way because he's the beloved disciple. And John, at the end of his crucifixion account in his gospel, he says, he who saw it, in other words, John, he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, so that you also may believe. And so that's how we should receive the Gospels. Right? These are eyewitness accounts by eyewitnesses, absolutely trustworthy, and we should take them simply like that. Now, the idea that somehow this would escape the trilemma, that by putting this fourth alternative, Jesus' claim to divinity was a myth, it doesn't really help matters, even from the logical point of view, because it makes it even more incredible. Because it simply transfers the trilemma to the apostles. The trilemma we said was either Jesus is who he said who he is, he's a lunatic or a liar. The idea that Christ's claim was a myth invented later by the early Christian community puts the same thing on them. Either Christ's claim was true, or they, the apostles, were lunatics having some kind of mass hallucination. I don't know, seeing Jesus rise from the dead when he didn't really rise. Or they were liars, putting into Jesus' mouth in the Gospels things that he didn't really say. And those three possibilities are just those two, right? That the apostles were liars, or that the apostles were lunatics, or the objects of some kind of hallucination, are equally impossible. No. Nobody today, no exegete thinks that the apostles were really knaves, frauds. That would be something that maybe a few unbelievers might wonder every once in a while. But no exegete can seriously think that the apostles weren't sincere, right? That they were trying to foist some conspiracy on the world. And so what you'd really have to the idea that they were sincere myth makers it just doesn't make any sense. No, it's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense of how the gospel spread. And the gospel spread precisely in this time of the living witness of the people who saw the event. Anyway, and so the point is that the idea that Jesus Christ's claim was a myth becomes more unbelievable than the truth, which is that he made this unbelievable claim, and he is who he says that he was. So let's just kind of summarize this. Either Christ is who he claimed that he was, or he was a lunatic or the devil, or his apostles were evil imposters, and nobody thinks that, who somehow managed to claim a divinity unheard of in human history, allowed themselves to be tortured and killed for it, and were eventually believed by a great part of the world, in the midst of the worst persecution. Now let's look at this now from a different point of view. Up till now, we've been just looking at it from the point of view of reason alone. Let's look at it now from the point of view of the church's faith in the Gospels. What does the church believe about the Gospels? Well, the fact is the church believes that the Gospels are, first of all, inspired Scripture, and therefore inerrant. And that means that if they make an historical claim, we have to take that historical claim to be true, because it's being said by God. Now, the church has recently written about this and spoken about this in the Second Vatican Council. It was one of the major themes of the Council's treatment of divine revelation, the question of the historical truth of the Gospels. And it's very beautifully treated in a document called Dei Verbum, the Word of God, especially in Numbers 18 and 19 of that document, Dei Verbum, from the Second Vatican Council. And Dei Verbum says that the apostolic origin of the four Gospels has been always and everywhere held in the church. The church has always and everywhere held that the four Gospels are apostolic. In other words, putting forth an eyewitness account. In the case of Matthew and John, directly by those eyewitnesses, the two apostles, Matthew and John. And in the case of Mark and Luke, really putting forth an account in Mark's case that's from Peter. Peter's preaching, And in Luke's case, it would be the gospel Paul preached, but which Luke also researched from other eyewitnesses. So the council says this: the church has always and everywhere held and continues to hold that the four gospels are of apostolic origin. For what the apostles preached in fulfillment of the commission of Christ, afterwards they themselves, Matthew and John, and apostolic men, that would be Mark and Luke, under the inspiration of the divine Spirit, handed on to us in writing the foundation of faith, the fourfold gospel. And then it goes on to speak about the historical trustworthiness, the true historical character. Holy Mother Church has firmly and with absolute constancy, so this is a strong statement of the Second Vatican Council, Holy Mother Church firmly with absolute constancy maintained and continues to maintain that the four Gospels just named, whose historicity she unhesitatingly affirms, faithfully hand on what Jesus, the Son of God, while he lived among men, really did and taught for their eternal salvation, for our eternal salvation. Right? So the Gospels faithfully hand on what Jesus really did and taught. And that would include his divine claim, right? His claim to be God. Now it's true that the sacred authors, when they wrote the four Gospels, they selected certain things. No, they didn't give everything that Jesus said and did, because John says at the end of his Gospel, if you gave everything Jesus said and did, all the books in the world wouldn't be enough to hold them. So they selected. They didn't give everything. They selected certain things. They synthesized certain of the many things which have been handed on. They synthesized or explained with an eye to the situation of the churches, maintaining the form of preaching. Right, the Gospels are kind of in the form of preaching, but always in such a fashion that they told us the honest truth about Jesus. Right? They told us the substance of what he said and did. And why? Precisely so that we might know the truth about the things that Jesus did. Right? So the fact that they selected certain things, they synthesized, doesn't mean that there are errors in it or that they added things that he didn't say. No, it's the opposite. It's not that they added things that he didn't say. It's that they selected among the many things that he said, certain of them. And we can see that by comparing the Gospels. The Gospels give us different things. No, the Gospel of Matthew gives us certain discourses. The Gospel of Mark focuses more on his miracles, and because that was Peter's preaching to the pagan Romans, whereas Matthew's preaching to the learned Jews, the Jews who knew the prophecies. And so he points out those elements. Peter emphasizes the miracles because he's speaking to pagans. Luke also speaks about the miracles, but he gives more teaching that many stories about Jesus' mercy, etc. And John gives us a deeper, more profound teaching because he's writing last. He's writing things that haven't yet been written. He's filling out what hadn't yet been given. So the different Gospels give us different things that he said. But we shouldn't think that they added on, but quite the contrary, that they selected, that they summarized. And so the fact that they summarized or selected doesn't imply any error. An error would be when you say something happened which didn't really happen. Right? And so it would be an error if Jesus didn't say, "You are Peter, on this rock I build my church." And Matthew put that in his mouth so as to reinforce church authority when at a time when they needed more. That's how sometimes exegetes speak about it. Right? That would be blasphemous. That would be having him say something that he didn't say on a matter crucial for the divine constitution of the church. You can understand why a Protestant would think that. But it still would be blasphemous. Right? We could say the same about if he didn't really say before Caiaphas that he was the Son of God. No, when Caiaphas asked him, "Are you the Son of God? The Son of the Most High, the Christ, the Son of the Most High?" He says yes. No, if he didn't really say that, then and the gospel accounts say that he did, that would be incompatible with it being the Word of God. I think so. We can't hold that. even though famous exegetes perhaps say things like that. Or if Jesus didn't really say the words that he said in John 6 about the bread of life discourse, it would be blasphemous for John to have put them in his mouth later, right? And so we can't think that. Now that doesn't mean we have the exact words of Jesus in chronological order. No, we don't. But what we do have is the true substance of what he said and did. And that's, in some sense, that's more important. Right? We've got the substance of what he said and did. The honest truth about Jesus, as Vatican II says. Right? And the way I interpret that, if we've got the honest truth about Jesus, it's the truth that could stand up in a court of law. John Paul II spoke about this in the year 2000, an important document that he wrote precisely in the year of the second millennium. Novo Millennio Ineunte, it's called, the coming in of the third millennium. And in this document, he says that in order for disciples of Christ today, in the third millennium, in order for us to be able to contemplate, to be able to pass on Christ to the world, we have to pass on our witness on the basis of contemplating the face of Jesus. And we can only do that if we've got the honest truth about Jesus, and if we've got the conviction and the faith that we have the honest truth about Jesus in the Gospels. And so he writes this: what we received from the apostles is a vision of faith based on precise historical testimony, a true testimony which the Gospels, despite their complex redaction and primarily catechetical purpose, pass on to us in an entirely trustworthy way. The Gospels don't claim to be a complete biography of Jesus in accordance with the canons of modern historical science. Well, that's true. What we mean by that is that the Gospels don't claim to be a biography like we might get of Franklin Roosevelt, 1,200 pages or something like that. No, the Gospels are short. They don't claim to be a modern historical biography. But nevertheless, from them, John Paul II says, the face of the Nazarene emerges with a solid historical foundation. The evangelists took pains to represent him on the basis of trustworthy testimonies, which they gathered, and working with documents which were subjected to careful ecclesial scrutiny. Right? You couldn't just write a gospel and have it be accepted by the church. There were other gospels written, we know. Those are the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas. And they were written by people who didn't have an ecclesial charge. They weren't apostles. They were written by heretics to justify a certain heretical view of Jesus, and the church didn't accept them. No, but the church accepted the four Gospels precisely because they were apostolic. Matthew and John, and then Mark and Luke, the disciples of Peter and Paul. And in this letter of John Paul II, Novo Millennio Ineunte, he also speaks about Jesus' self-awareness. That Christ knew who he was. Oh, and he knew who he was, we see from the Gospels, when he was 12 years old. Right? He knew he was the Son of God. Right from the beginning. Right from the beginning of our presentation of Jesus. Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Or again, the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. Benedict speaks about this in his Jesus and Others, his book, and he writes, if historical is understood to mean that the discourses of Jesus transmitted to us have to be something like a recorded transcript. In other words, as if you put a tape recorder at the Sermon on the Mount. Well, that's not what they are. Because if they were just a tape recorder, they would have had to be a lot longer. Right? They would be, as John said, you wouldn't have enough books to, if you were to tape everything he said and did. So what the Gospels give us is the substance. Right? The fact that they make no claim to literal accuracy of a tape recorder by no means implies that they're merely Jesus' poems. What the gospel is really claiming is that it has correctly rendered the substance of the discourses, right? That's what we believe. That's what the gospels give us. That we today really do encounter the decisive content of what Jesus said and did. Cardinal Ratzinger, when he was still cardinal, he has a book on the Catechism of the Catholic Church, how it came to be written. And in it, he speaks about how the Catechism doesn't follow the modern exegetes. No, the Catechism takes the historical truth of the Gospels literally. No? And he got a lot of criticism for that. People said that the Catechism was not historically critical, etc. And so he says simply, Ratzinger, the Catechism trusts the biblical word. It holds the Christ of the Gospels to be the real Jesus. It is convinced that all the Gospels tell us about the same Jesus, and all of them together help us, each in its own way, to know the true Jesus of history, which is no other than the Christ of faith. Right? The Jesus of history and the Christ of faith are one and the same. This basic position has earned the Catechism vehement attacks by certain Catholic intellectuals, by certain theologians. The Catechism, it is alleged, has slept through an entire century of exegesis, is utterly ignorant of literary genres, form, and redactional history, and the like, has not progressed beyond a fundamentalist exegesis. However, he says, the portrayal of Jesus that modern research has uncovered in the Gospels in no way forces us to go behind the text to construct another. In other words, it doesn't force us to do that kind of archaeology that we spoke about at the beginning. To construct another allegedly purely historical Jesus, while stigmatizing the gospel portrait of Jesus as a product of the community's faith. As to the further claim that different communities believed in different, incompatible Christs, it's hard to see how such minimal historical reality, such a contradictory mass of fabrications by the communities, could produce in such a short time that common faith that transformed the world. Yeah. In other words, the early Christian community didn't invent anything. Right? What made the witness of the early Christian community transform the world is the witness of Christ, who they were closer to than we are today. Right? And how much closer? Incomparably closer. And so we today, all our knowledge, can't be based on today our trying to do archaeology. It has to be based on our humbly receiving the witness of the Gospels. St. Thomas Aquinas, he was writing about the Manichees. The Manichees and the Gnostics in the early church, they did something similar. Now, they wrote other Gospels, which they claimed were the really historical ones, and they said that the church's Gospels were false. But the problem was, those Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, weren't written by eyewitnesses. They were written a century later by people who didn't have anything to do with the original events. And they were written precisely to justify a particular philosophy or heresy. And what they said, one of the things that they held, was that Christ didn't really have a human nature. Because they thought that the body was bad. That was their heresy. The body is the source of evil. And if the body is the source of evil, well, Christ couldn't have assumed a true human nature. So they had to rewrite the Gospels to subtract the reality of his incarnation and above all his suffering and death. And of course, you lose everything, when you do that. And so Thomas Aquinas, writing about that, he says, this position wipes out the authority of Scripture, among other things. Because if the Gospels tell us the Word was made flesh and he didn't really become flesh, then it's all a lie. And it would also lie when it says Jesus Christ walked, ate, died, and was buried. If these things took place only in apparent fantasy, then the Gospels would be lies. But if even in a moderate way, Thomas Aquinas writes, the authority of Scripture be denied, then there will be nothing fixed anymore in our faith, which depends on sacred Scripture. For as John says, these things were written that you may believe. And this is the real crisis that we're in today. so many exegetes say we can't trust Scripture to know what really happened in history. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas is right. Even in a moderate way, this isn't a moderate way, this isn't a gigantic way, but if even in a moderate way, Scripture were to lose its authority, well then our faith would ultimately lack all its foundation. Yeah. And so the result wouldn't be a more critically correct Christianity. It would ultimately lead to apostasy. Yeah. So what's our conclusion? We can trust the history given us in the Gospels for two reasons. Because it's absolutely reasonable to do so, and because it's our faith that the Gospels are inspired, the Word of God, and give us the true historical reality of what Christ said and did. Thank you.